Welcome back, my dear followers. This is a new episode of the history of the American Mafia, the true story of the American Mafia, written and adapted to podcast by Fabio Fabiano and read and translated by me in English, Grace Carlisi. Today's episode is about Joe the Boss, or Giuseppe Maranzano. Today we think of the Mafia as a synonym of organized crime, but the truth is, in the beginning, the American Mafia was not so organized at all. In the early 1900s, it was poorly structured, and as a symptom of this lack of organization, there were brutal wars between minor gangs waged against each other to dominate over various rackets. The gangs formed by the Italians compared to those of the Jews and the Irish, who were much better organized. The components were disciplined, ruthless, efficient, especially at times when wars were unleashed over the disputes over territories and customers. The survival of individual criminals required courage, cruelty, and a lot of luck. Joe Masseria was one of these few organized crime leaders who embodied these qualities. Masseria was born on January 17, 1886, in Sicily, exactly in Menfi, a small town in the province of Agrigento, and then moved with his family to Marsala to stay with a family of tailors. He was also known as just Joe the Boss. He can be considered one of the first bosses of the Italian-American Mafia in New York City. I'd like to take a minute and bring to your attention the fact I said boss. In fact, it is from this moment onward that the bosses were no longer considered godfathers. This is a significant detail regarding the evolution of the organization. No longer is a word similar to father, as godfather is, used to indicate the man at the top of the organization. Instead, he is referred to as the boss. Masseria from 1922 to 1931 was the head of what is now called the Genoese crime family, one of the 5 families of the New York City Mafia. Young Joe's career got off to a dazzling start. Already at the age of 17, he was convicted in Italy for murder. So to escape the punishment, he boarded a steamship and set sail for the United States. When he arrived in America, like many Italian immigrants with a criminal record, following his own criminal nature, he found nothing better to do than join the Italian clandestine gangs in New York. He was short and stout and had chubby cheeks and small eyes, so that some of his enemies called him the Chinese man. From police files, we have the data of his first arrest, that on the 1st of February 1907, Francesca Delise, living at 198 Elizabeth Street, returning to her home on the 2nd floor, found the door smashed open. She entered and was surprised to find Giuseppe Masseria and Giuseppe Lima in the act of stealing valuables. Joe Masseria was only in his 20s and had already lived in New York for 3 years at 217 Forsey Street. Following the trial, he was sentenced, but was released to prison for suspended sentence. His accomplice, Lima, married Pedro Morello's sister, or Maria. It was obvious that this union gave Masseria the first link between his family and the Morello family, which, as you, my dear faithful followers, already know, was the first mafia family in New York, today still operating as the Genoese family. As a young man, Masseria worked for the Morello crime family in Harlem, Little Italy. Masseria's second offence took place on April 13, 1913. Joe, together with 3 accomplices, was arrested on charges of burglary of the Simpsons pawn shop at 146 Bowery Street in Manhattan. Pietro, Pete the Bum, Lagatutta, and the brothers Salvatore Giuseppe Rufino from Brooklyn all ended up in his cell. The judge sentenced Masseria, who was taken to the well-known Sing Sing prison to serve the sentence of 4.5 years. They had gone out to a great lengths to carry out the theft. Pietro Lagatutta had rented the apartment overlooking the courtyard behind the pawn shop that they had intended to rob. On the night of Saturday, April the 12th, 1913, The thieves drilled a hole in the back of the wall. Once inside, they planned to break into the vault. Unfortunately for them, a policeman saw a blanket tucked into the pawnshop wall and gave out the alarm. The intervening policeman arrested the 3 thieves as they tried to escape. On the 17th of January 1916, Masseria turned 30 in prison. He had 2 criminal convictions and 3 small children to feed. His job within the Morello family was to dispense violence and brutality against anyone who threatened the gang's operations. In this, he was truly commendable, so much so that he climbed the ranks of the criminal organization. After the arrest of the head of the bosses, Giuseppe Morello and his brother-in-law Ignazio Lupo, known as the Wolf for counterfeiting and its consequent sentence, which they served in the federal prison of Atlanta, a power vacuum was created at the top of the first mafia family in New York. To fill it in, the mafia family has elected Salvatore d'Aquila. Meanwhile, Masseria, released from the Sing Sing prison, took advantage of the opportunity to form his gang. With his natural talent for violence, Masseria soon became one of the most powerful and feared gangsters in New York. When Giuseppe Morello the Claw came out of prison, Masseria was under the control of d'Aquila, but he intended to make his way and become the head of the New York family. In his gang, Masseria included not only Morello's half-brothers, the Terranova brothers, but also young and promising criminals who would become the elite of the American Mafia, including Salvatore Lucania, Francesco Castiglia, Gaetano Lucchese, or, as they would later be known as, Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Tommy Three Fingers Brown. To make way for his gang amongst the other gangs, he had ordered about 30 murders, and when he gave out the order to have someone killed, he would say to his acolytes, "Get this stone out of my shoe." He liked to gorge himself on pasta, and when he spoke, he spat out the spaghetti he was chewing. Because of his greed for power and food, he was also renamed Joe the Gluttonous. Like all gangsters, he dressed well, but was scruffy at the same time. He didn't speak English very well and most of the time used the Sicilian dialect. Many portrayed him as a vulgar and very presumptuous man. He possessed a disproportionate ego. In the underworld, he had the reputation of being a ruthless criminal, and an extremely lucky one at that. In at least 2 occasions he managed to dodge the bullets that rival gangsters had fired at him. In 1922 he was engaged in a war that put him up against Umberto Valenti for the control of the East Village in Manhattan. It was in the context of this war that one of the Joe Morello's half-brothers, Vincenzo Terranova, was killed. Valenti had a momentary advantage over his rival, but the killer's bullets didn't stop. This time, the lead was destined for Masseria himself. The head of the New York Mafia, Salvatore Totò d'Aquila, was the conceiver of an ambush against Joe Masseria. It was August the 9th, 1922. Joe Masseria had become very rich due to alcohol smuggling. He had earned so much money that, as often occurs in these cases, it had gone to his head. Uncle Totò had a very simple and ruthless plan: get Joe out of the way and replace him with Umberto Valenti. Therefore, he summoned the ghost, to whom he had made a proposal which could not be refused, and Valenti was to take care of the details. The ghost, who had earned his nickname from the American criminals for his infallible way of operating when it comes to killing and then disappearing, organized Joe Masseria's murder. The plan was a classic gangster ambush. 4 killers in a blue sedan parked on the 2nd Avenue, armed with well-oiled .45 caliber automatic Colts, awaited the victim as he left his house and unloaded their guns on him. Jumped back in the car as it quickly escaped from the scene. The only problem this time was that Masseria wasn't dead. To investigate what happened, we traced an article in the New York Times written by an eyewitness who declared, "At the first shots, the man jumped to the side. Then the shooter fired again, and this time the man who was being targeted dropped his head forward. The man fired again, and once again the victim lowered his head. The third shot made a second hole in my window. At this point, the hitmen interrupted the operation. Failing their target, they jumped into a running board of the blue Hudson Cruiser and drove away, with the engine roaring down West 5th Street, where they ran into more trouble. As a matter of fact, that same day, some workers had met to strike on the 5th Street. The meeting had just ended and the street was occupied by a procession of angry socialists, pissed off and tired of gangsters, factory owners and capitalist bastards in general. The striking workers erected a human blockade to stop the fleeing Hudson, but the killers remained impassive. They attempted to make their way through the human block, but unable to disperse the crowd, they opened fire into the crowd, hitting 6 men and a pony. According to the version of the New York Call newspaper, the car, after rushing through the panicking crowd, was chased by 15 taxis, trucks and private cars that had been hijacked by the police. The chase went as far as the 32nd Street, where police lost the gunman. Joe Masseria, following the failed ambush, was stunned and lost his hat, but his moves to dodge the bullets made him a legend in the mob world. The cops went to interrogate Joe the Boss Masseria and found him sitting in his apartment in 82 2nd Avenue. He was dizzy, 2 bullets had pierced his straw hat and 1 had gone through his coat. He had no intention to delay his reply to Valenti, so on the 11th of August 1922, Umberto Valenti was lured into a restaurant on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 12th Street, under the pretext of a meeting to restore peace. It has not yet been possible to understand who took part in that meeting, although it is known that Giuseppe Morello was present. Realizing his life was in danger, Valenti stormed out of the room when 2 elegant men, armed with revolvers, began shooting at him. Turning abruptly, Valenti pulled out a revolver, just as a bullet went through his chest. According to tradition, it seems that one of the shooters was none other than Charlie Lucky Luciano, and the new protégé of the Masserias. The other shooter was probably Vito Genovese. Valenti escaped and managed to reach the door of a passing taxi before collapsing mortally wounded. After shooting, a crowd formed to block the escape of the armed men. The murderers then opened fire to scare the crowd, unconcerned about all the innocent people killing a bin man and a girl. The crowd dispersed as they managed to escape through a nearby block of flats. The Herald wrote, Valenti, who is said to have hated Masseria, was killed as mercilessly as one might swat a fly. Masseria was arrested for his murder. During his arrest, smiling, he allegedly asked the cops if he should be wearing his pajamas. Immediately after this murder, Giuseppe Masseria began to be called Joe the Boss. Masseria, out of gratitude, elevated Charles Lucky Luciano to a leadership position within his criminal organization. The charges against Masseria for the murder of Valenti, due to lack of evidence, were dropped, and Joe was released. The years that followed saw an armed peace between Masseria and Aquila, interested in making their business prosper. The two knew quite clearly that shootings and murders were bad for business. The dispute between the two bosses ended permanently on the evening of the 10th of October 1928, with the killing of Salvatore d'Aquila in Manhattan. From an investigative point of view, since there were no longer characters of the caliber of Petrosino and Flynn to oppose the mafia, the New York Police Department lacked the ability to collect evidence to indict the leaders of the American mafia.